Welcome back, quarantines. Hope you had a good brain break. Let's get back into it. Again, this is a two-part lecture on foreign policy in the Cold War, and we're about to specifically embark on Vietnam. Now, we're making a lot of really big sweeping generalizations here. This is stuff that we would have discussed over the course of a week, if not more, and we're condensing it into one two-part lecture. So this is going to be a lot of sweeping historical generalizations. So we're making a lot of broad generalizations here. Before we get back into it, a question I get a lot just to get our brains like off the break and back to it. And I know my brain is somewhere else too. I was just reading this book about anti-gravity and it is impossible to put down. But really, a question that a lot of students ask me usually whenever we're in person, talking about this stuff is like, why are we afraid of communism anyway? What's the point? This containing communism is dominating our foreign policy for decades. And, that's the boomer thing, right? Like boomers were the people who were super afraid of communism, that they were born in the 50s. They were really concerned about this, dominated their foreign policy when they were kids. And Zoomers, I feel like you don't get it, And so my answer usually, I challenge people to think of it from an economic perspective, right? Because communism was scary because it's so different than what we knew as people who live in a democratic society. But also, when we're talking about big policy drivers, like, let's think about it from a big, sweeping economic perspective. World War II ended the Great Depression, right? And we can have a historical discussion on why specifically World War II ended the Great Depression. Was it because of New Deal programs that finally worked? Was it because of the war itself? Was it? All right, that's fine. We can have historical discussions about that, and we will have more historical discussions about that because that will be on this year's AP test. But it did, right? I mean, the Great Depression ended with World War II because we're producing all this stuff. We're producing tanks and guns and planes and all these things, really high production, lots of jobs. And so the fear was when the war ends, what happens to all those jobs? What happens if production just stops? Do we slide back into the Great Depression? And that's a scary thing. So Americans were nervous about that. So what we did is instead of producing guns and tanks and things, we started producing consumer goods like vacuum cleaners and cars and jeans and things, right? And so whenever we're producing all of that stuff, we need somewhere to sell it to. But when a country becomes communist, they nationalize their economy, which means that communist countries are not open to trade generally. Okay, so that's scary. If the whole world becomes communist, we don't have anywhere to sell our stuff to. And then all of those jobs that, have to produce that stuff is gone. And we could fall back into a Great Depression. And so a lot of these big time policy drivers containing communism, it has a lot to do with economic drivers and the fear of markets being closed, right? We need access to those markets for our economy to stay stimulated. And so therefore, we gotta resist the spread of communism. And so, the Marshall Plan is evidence of that. The Marshall Plan is us injecting ourselves into European markets so that we can increase production and continue the increase of production. So 100%, there is an economic driver to stopping the spread of communism. And that is dominating American foreign policy. And we've talked about it up to this point. We talked about containment in Truman's presidency. We talked about containment in Eisenhower's presidency. We talked about containment in Kennedy's presidency. And so now we're going to talk about Vietnam, and a quick history of the country of Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony. And when World War II ended, without getting into a whole nother historical discussion, colonialization also ended with World War II. We've been fighting this war against tyranny. How can we be resisting the right of self-determination for all these other countries? And so France, ended its colonial control of Vietnam, and Vietnam, pretty quickly became communist. And France tried to resist the spread of communism in Vietnam, but largely failed, and so they withdrew, which is actually happened in Eisenhower's administration. So Eisenhower started supporting communist resistance in Vietnam, and Kennedy took that up, right? And so there was the sending of of Americans to Vietnam to train South Vietnamese soldiers to resist the spread of communism in Vietnam, but they were supposed to be non-combat, right? Like, American soldiers weren't supposed to be taking up arms against the Viet Cong, against the northern Vietnamese communist, right? They were supposed to be there in a support capacity. And all that changes under Johnson's presidency. And so that's what we're going to get into now. You know, a friendly or a reminder, it's not all that friendly. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Johnson took over. Lyndon B. Johnson took over when Kennedy was killed. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow in our civil rights domestic type stuff lecture. But just from a foreign policy perspective, you know, Johnson inherited this like trickle of troops to Vietnam, and it wasn't working. You know, like the North Viet Cong, the communist forces were strong in Vietnam, and there was broad popular support for communism in Vietnam, and so Johnson saw that, and you know, saw a need that if we were really going to resist the spread of communism in Vietnam, we were going to have to put more support there, right? Military support. And so this is where we pick up. All right. I mean, we've been talking about containment, and Vietnam is also an exercise in containment. Almost every foreign policy in the Cold War can be stemmed back to containing the spread of communism. And Vietnam, the war in Vietnam is one big giant containment strategy, right? And so I have a map here of a rough map of Vietnam. And so this is going to be the DMZ, like this is the zone that separates North Vietnam and South Vietnam. We're going to get into that more later, but this is the Gulf of Tonkin, all right? And that's the center of troop escalation, because we had a boat in the Gulf of Tonkin. Boat, right? And Johnson brought it to the attention of Congress that boat was fired upon. It was attacked. You know, the communist forces in North Vietnam attacked an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, and we had no authority to respond to it because it wasn't a war. You know, we hadn't declared war. Our troops were there in a non-combat capacity. So whenever our ship is being fired upon, Johnson was making the point that we need the ability to defend ourselves, right? I mean, the Vietnamese forces, the North Vietnamese communist forces, are attacking an American ship. And like now, we have got to defend ourselves against that attack. And so he took that to Congress, and Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Very, very hugely important piece of legislation, because basically it wrote a blank check to the president to send as many forces, as many guns, to do whatever he needed to fight this war in Vietnam without ever declaring war, right? Vietnam never had war declared. Congress is supposed to be the one the entity that can declare war, and they never did. Instead, they passed this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and it was a blank check to the president, so where he could fight this war in whatever capacity he needed. And so with this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it escalated the war, is like what your textbooks will say. But really, it became Johnson's war now. You know, although Eisenhower supported anti-communist forces in Vietnam and Kennedy sent troops there in non-combat capacity, Johnson is the president who's known as the one who escalated the war in Vietnam. And it very much becomes Johnson's war. And so, on a side note, do you want to know what damage was done to the boat in the Gulf of Tonkin? Minimal. Like, some people estimate just a couple bullet holes, actually, in the side of that boat. So, questionable need for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in hindsight, in historical hindsight, but there's a whole nother historical debate to be had there. So, in the interest of time, let's continue on and talk about how this impacted Johnson. And look, we're going to talk about Johnson a lot tomorrow. Johnson had a lot of really big domestic victories, a lot of really big deal domestic policies. But you know what? Johnson's Johnson's legacy became mired by this Vietnam conflict, right? I mean, he was the president who escalated the war. His presidency becomes dominated by the war. Whatever domestic successes he has is overshadowed by the foreign blunders associated with the war in Vietnam, and eventually it ruins him. I mean, Johnson ends up, not even running for another term because the turmoil associated with Vietnam is so great. So Johnson escalates the war. So now we are really in it. Like this is a war that we've gone to Vietnam and we're combating. We're fighting against the Northern Vietnamese forces, which, by the way, North Vietnam borders China. Just a quick map note there. Okay, China's communist, and so we're fighting against these Viet Cong forces, supporting the anti-communist forces in Vietnam, which is of questionable popularity. Is a good way to put it. Okay, so we are now in it, like for real. Like about 1964, 1965 is when we were first escalating that war, and now there's a draft, right? Like people are being drafted, young people are being drafted to go fight this war, and it's a military, like it's tough, right? The North Vietnamese forces, although the United States military is much better equipped. And for the most part, from a military perspective, the war wasn't that bad. It just wasn't an immediate victory. And people kept on thinking it was going to be an immediate victory. And so probably the most important part from an American history perspective, the most important part of the war in Vietnam is our resistance to it as the American public. And so let's start with a quick story about the draft. The draft. This is the last time the draft has been instituted in the war in Vietnam, and everybody was in it, right? Like my dad tells a story. My dad was born in 1950. He was 18 in 1968, and so the way the draft worked was by birthdays. So like people would turn on the TV and watch those ping pong balls in the draft, in the lottery, and the ping pong balls are all around, and one pops up in a little window, and it's got a number on it, and they all pop up. That's what it was for your birthday. That's what the draft looked like. So people would turn on the TV and watch the draft, and whatever your birthday is would be, if those numbers were selected, you were drafted. So my dad's birthday is November 28th, 1950. So 11 would be the first number, 28 would be the second number, 50 would be the third number. And if those three numbers popped up, everyone born on November 28th, 1950 goes to the draft, right? And so my dad watched it on TV with all of his friends, and the closest it got was 11/29/50. So he missed the draft by one number, but lots of his friends were drafted, and lots of people were drafted into the war in Vietnam, young people. And the longer the war went on, the younger the people got who were drafted. Now, there were a couple ways to avoid the draft. You could be injured or be medically unable to go, or you could go to college, right? So if you can imagine who gets to go to college in the 1960s and early 70s are the people who can afford it, right? So wealthy people, senators' sons, big businessmen, people who were rich enough to just enroll in college, they didn't have to go fight in the war. But people who were not that privileged, they did. They got drafted, and it was illegal not to go. You go to jail or you go to the war, right? And so so there's already some class tension associated with the feelings about the war in Vietnam. Also, from a race perspective, there was there was more African Americans drafted into the war than what the population would ultimately reflect. So a ton of African Americans, especially because it was an economic issue, as I mentioned before, people who were wealthy enough to enroll into college could avoid the draft, but not a lot of African Americans in the 1960s and early 1970s were in the position of that kind of privilege due to ongoing Jim Crow and struggle with civil rights, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. So, there was a racial perspective there too of there was a class distinction of people who were being drafted in the war, and there was a racial distinction of people who were being drafted into this war. And so there was already frustrations around the inequities of the draft, right? That was there. And so young people, especially as the war went on, young people continued and continued to be very vocally opposed to this war. Not only from a youth age class and racial perspective. But, the government, the media played a really big role in how people felt about the war too, because this is the first time, the 1960s is the first time that most Americans have television sets in their living rooms. And so people can turn on the news, and there were live broadcasters on the ground in Vietnam telling, showing people images of what was happening there. What were American soldiers doing? What did the war look like? How was the war going, And the government was coming out and saying, oh, these are American heroes, we're doing great. The war is going well. We're winning. And then people would change the channel from President Johnson telling us how good the war was going and switch the channels to Walter Cronkite on the evening news. And, he was saying, it's not going well. The government is not portraying this accurately. Look at what our American soldiers are doing. The news broadcasted atrocities that showed American soldiers in a very unfavorable light. And the American news broadcasted what looked like military blunders, what looked like military losses. And so what you have back home in America is a gap between what the government is telling us is happening and then what the news is showing us is happening. And that's known now as the credibility gap, right? There's a big gap in between what the government says and then what we see actually happening on the ground. And so people increasingly distrust what Johnson and the government is telling us about the war. We're drafting our sons to go fight in this war, and you're telling us it's going great and they're winning, and well, they're not. It doesn't look good from the perspective of the American public. So Johnson is his approval ratings are plummeting, and this brings us to the year 1968. So the war is largely being protested by several different sectors of society for several different reasons. It's very unpopular, and yet there is an insistence that from the government that the war is going well, and that brings us to the start of 1968, and the Tet, T-E-T, is the Vietnamese New Year. And so we thought it was going to be a day off. Like, our military assumed that there wouldn't be a lot of fighting on this day because it's a Vietnamese holiday. And the Viet Cong troops launched a large-scale offensive and attacked a whole bunch of different American bases. And actually, it wasn't that bad from a military perspective. Like, it wasn't a big military loss, but it looked bad. Because here the government's telling us the war's over, we're doing great, and then the northern Vietnamese troops are launching this major offensive. Like, what do you mean it's going great? That's not true. And so it was a big blow to the military from a PR perspective, although not that bad from an actual military perspective. But the Tet Offensive happens at the start of 1968. Johnson's approval ratings take another hit as a result. People are very unhappy with Johnson. 1968 goes along. 1968 is also the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So that increased the turmoil back home and increased tension from a racial perspective and a class perspective. And then also in 1968, Johnson, mired by the war and ultimately unable to recover from it politically, he announces that he's not going to run for another term of president, right? I mean, he was the presumptive Democratic nominee. It's an election year. There's a Democratic president. The Democrat is probably going to run again, and he made the announcement that he's not going to, because ultimately he could not overcome the credibility gap. He didn't want to anymore. All right. Johnson was eventually nailed and buried by the war that he escalated. And so Johnson steps down. He says, I'm not running for president. And so now the Democrats have to find a new nominee. And the front runner is actually Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's little brother. And so people are like, all right, Johnson stepped down. Robert Kennedy's going to become our nominee. And in the summer of 1968, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. And so that increased the turmoil. The Democrats, ironically, once at the beginning of this two-part lecture, remember, Truman was a Democrat who was soft on communism. And now, ultimately, Democrats are being buried by this war in Vietnam trying to fight against communism. And so the Democratic Party just couldn't recover from the blunder of the escalation of the war in Vietnam. And in 1968, Richard Nixon is elected president amongst all of this turmoil. At the Democratic National Convention in 1968, there were riots in the streets. about the war. Anti-war protesters were getting beat up by police officers. Things had turned violent. It was an absolute political nightmare. And the war in Vietnam, ultimately, Democrats couldn't recover from it. And so Richard Nixon is elected president in 1968, promising to end the war in Vietnam. He ran on this idea of law and order, and he was going to restore order to the streets of America, especially when it came to like how young people were getting violent protesting. And this is also in the midst of the civil rights movement. And so Richard Nixon's elected basically saying, I'm going to end this war in Vietnam. And he doesn't right away, but eventually he does. And so we're talking about all this stuff. This is Cold War foreign policy, talking about the war in Vietnam from a containment perspective. That was the name of the game. And then when Richard Nixon takes over, people are tired of containment. Like I said, Democrats were once labeled soft on communism, like we need to do more to contain the spread of communism. And then Johnson's escalation of the war in Vietnam to contain the spread of communism ended up, ultimately being a political nightmare for him and cost the Democrats the presidency in 1968. And so when Nixon takes over, he enacts this policy of détente. It's French. Détente is the intentional easing of Cold War tensions. Like, he is going to intentionally end the Cold War. We're not going to devote all of our resources to contain communism anymore. We're going to try and take a step back, scale it back, slow it down. And so he does. He has this idea of Vietnamization for the War of Vietnam. Like, we're going to turn over control of the war back over to South Vietnamese troops. So, like, we're going to withdraw our troops and just leave a few people there to train the South Vietnamese forces and then let them fight their own war. And people really like that idea. Nixon was elected with the idea of détente, that we're going to end this Cold War. We're going to scale back these tensions. I mean, he didn't do it quick enough. In the early 70s, Kent State, there were anti-Vietnam protests at Kent State University in Ohio. And the protest turned violent and 4 kids were killed. 4 college students were killed by police at Kent State over these anti-war protests. And so Nixon didn't withdraw fast enough. And the protests stayed there in his presidency as well. Also during Nixon's presidency, the New York Times released the Pentagon Papers, which exasperated the credibility gap and led to a lot of increasing distrust for the government. The Pentagon Papers essentially were all these classified documents about the war in Vietnam that proved that the government was indeed lying to the American public about how the war was going for a lot of it. And so people were even more exasperated with the government, distrustful of the government, tired of the war in Vietnam. Nixon wasn't acting fast enough to end it. Although, Nixon, obviously Nixon is going to be go down as not favorable in history because of Watergate, because he lied and obstructed justice and ultimately, resigned from the presidency, and that's what he's known for is Watergate. But he, to his credit, he did open up trade with China, a communist country. Because remember, when a country becomes communist, they close themselves off to trade. But Nixon went to China, made an effort to reach out to that communist country, ease the tensions of the Cold War, and that's when we started trading with China, which obviously really a big deal. We just trade with China all the time. And to Nixon's credit, he's the first person to do that and to reduce those tensions with a communist country. So anyway, Nixon did eventually withdraw our troops. Vietnam did eventually kind of fall to communism. It's a conflict that it's hard to label as a success, but we're going to look a little bit more about that in our discussion post that you guys are going to do. But overall, containment, the foreign policy perspective, the foreign policy job of the late 40s, starting with Truman, all the way into the early 70s, ending with Nixon. this is it's containment. It's all about containment. You know, that's our Cold War, name of the Cold War game. So we're going to, with détente, we're going to end the foreign policy containment thing. That would be kind of the end of time period 8. So that's where we're going to end this lecture. Again, a lot of sweeping, broad generalizations. I hope to clear some of them up in the discussion post you guys are going to be participating in on Canvas. And I hope that you guys will read some of the extra resources I link at the end of the week to do some justice to time period 8. All right. But so for right now, let's wrap this up. Cold War policy, containment, credibility gap. And from an American perspective, you know, we can have a lot of historical discussions about the legacy of Vietnam. So let's hope to have some of those in our discussion post. And I hope you guys are enjoying, to the best of our abilities, our quarantine. And I hope you laughed at my jokes. See you later.